excited to be here. I'm trying not to feel too underqualified as the only person in the first block without a PhD. But here I am. And so as Dr. Starkey mentioned, I am the Director of Sustainability for Darling Ingredients. I think, yeah, sure. Can I stay here? Yeah, sure. Um, I'm the Director of Sustainability for Darling Ingredients, and we do. And most people in this room probably know Darling, unlike most of the rooms that I talk in. So happy to have an audience here, and we are going to talk a little bit focused on fertilizer. But I did want to start a little bit in how we can grow animal protein value from fertilizer potentially. And so I did want to start with a little bit about Darling and how we talk about rendering. I mean, everyone in this room probably knows rendering and understands rendering. But we've been trying to think about how we talk about rendering to an outside audience and the other things that we do. We're going to talk about insects in just a minute, and we talk about collagen and gelatin as well. And so, how are we taking these byproducts? We're collecting byproducts, we're collecting waste materials, and we're looking for those places where things are underutilized and bringing them into the business. Then we process it through either rendering or gelatin production or collagen production or growing insects or making biogas. Vast amount of different business lines that we have. And then we're looking to create valuable products that people need, that animals need, and being able to feed animals, feed society, and fuel society as well through our renewable diesel, through sustainable aviation fuel, and the other business and the biogas businesses that we have. So that's really how we're trying to talk about what we do and the circular economy. We're going to have talks today on the circular economy, and that's really how we're trying to talk about rendering. It really is that original circular economy, and we're really glad to be part of that. If you don't know much about Darling, we process about 15% of the world's slaughtered animal byproducts. So around the world, pretty big, mostly in North America, Europe, and Brazil. We have some other locations as well. Part of that people don't know about rendering is you create a lot of water out of the plants as well. So we return over 12 billion gallons of water a year back to the environments that we operate in. And because a lot of the raw material is local, that's keeping water in the watershed that might not necessarily be there if we weren't present. We sell over 3 billion pounds of low carbon intensity. Sorry, I try not to use acronyms when I can avoid it. Feedstocks. And we also make electricity in Europe. So we have enough electricity to power about 52,000 homes in Europe every year, and enough emissions offset it from the renewable diesel with our joint venture Diamond Green Diesel, where we take the equivalent emissions of over 2 million cars a year off the road. So it's a really exciting impact that we have. That's hard to see what this animal byproduct industry has, and we're proud to be a really big part of that and providing these different products. So why do we have a fertilizer business on top of all the other different things that we have? Well, like every business, it's a profit center for us. We can sell, as Dr. Starkey mentioned, there's some of the products may not have a good feed ratio or something like that. So we can utilize it in fertilizer and grow plants. And so that's a great application for us. It also serves as a bit of an internal hedge on price fluctuations. So, it tends to widen margins when the protein markets are going down, but it tends to compress them a little bit when the protein prices are going up. So that allows us to have a little bit of a flexibility in terms of how we look at the protein markets. And then, like we mentioned, contingency planning. Sometimes if you have a load that doesn't quite meet spec or something like that, that's not going to be as good in a feed application, we can look at utilizing it in a fertilizer application and blending it with some other things to really provide a valuable product for some of our customers. So who are those customers in the fertilizer place? The biggest one is the organic agriculture. These are organic fertilizers. They're from natural processes, so they can be used in organic agriculture. And organic fruit and vegetable is really where we see a lot of our fertilizers go. We also have golf courses and lawn care and sports turf, and even some retail products as well that are sold on the open market. So people can use organic fertilizers in their homes or in their landscaping and have a sustainable alternative to conventional fertilizer if they want. But what goes into the fertilizer? And again, so I meant to mention at the top, so We have Rick Geisey in our business who is the expert on this, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here this week, but I'm happy to speak on his behalf. But he's really the expert in terms of how we do things. I've got his contact information at the end. If you really have in-depth questions on this, I can definitely talk through a lot of things, but he'd be glad to take your call if you really want to get in depth on some of the fertilizer. But what do we use? We use a lot of feather meal in our fertilizer applications. We also use meat and bone meal and blood meal are some of the main ones that we sort of use. There's lots of different things that get blended into it as well. And we have other inputs that we blend in for specific uses or specific applications, specific specs that customers might be looking for. So why do we use those? Why does it impact, how does it impact fertility value, and why is it good for the soil? Why are our customers looking for these? Feather meal is very high in protein, which is very high in, or makes it very high in organic nitrogen. So 12 to 24%, or 12 to 14%, sorry, it is very hard to read these slides at this angle. But you have very high organic nitrogen. So that's a lot of interest to folks that are looking for nitrogen content. Meat and bone meal is more balanced from a nitrogen, phosphate, and calcium source. And the difference is in available phosphorus. So you don't have, it's not the traditional phosphate that you have. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but you have available phosphate and calcium, which really add to the nutritional value that you're not going to get from a traditional NPK fertilizer that you buy off the shelf. So it really can add value to the soil health, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Let's step off for just a second so I can read my slide here. Bone meal is really high in phosphate and calcium, so similar benefits there. And then blood meal, similar to feather meal, you have really high organic nitrogen. The challenges with blood meal are it's really light, so it doesn't work quite as well in some applications, but we do blend it to add some of the fertility value in. So what determines the value of organic fertilizer? What are we looking at when we think about how it compares to other fertilizer choices that may be out on the market? Obviously, number one is what kind of nutrition is available in the fertilizer. So we have chemical analysis that can work through what different batches have, and we're working to spec with customers on that. How available are the nutrients for feeding the soil? That's really where meat and bone meal, feather meal shine, is that they have really high nutrient availability and they're also naturally slow release. So instead of oversaturating your soil with nutrients, they will release the nutrients slowly into the soil. And so that really adds a lot of value there. And so we really think in Darling and in our Nature Safe fertilizer brand, we really are thinking about feeding the soil like you would feed an animal. So a lot of what we're hearing today about thinking about how you feed an animal, what nutrients they need, we're thinking about soil in that same way. So how do you feed the soil in the same way that you'd be looking to feed an animal? And then that in turn, if you have a healthy soil, it's going to feed the plant. So meat and bone meal, there's some benefits to using meat and bone meal. For one, fertilizer doesn't require species identification. And so, if you need flexibility within if we need flexibility within the business, they're not species specific requests like you might have in feed. There is one labeling requirement that you cannot apply on pasture land because of BSE concerns. So that's something that has to be considered, but typically within you don't see the need for species specific if you're applying to vegetables or anything like that. So that's not an issue in most of the markets. So how do we look at fertilizer and think about it from a broader perspective of how do we add value back to the value of rendered products? And how can we look at proteins and look at fertilizer as an opportunity to increase the value of our rendered products? The challenge, there's some hurdle. One is that organic, you need demand for like any product, you need demand for it in order to have a market to go to. If you look at organic fruits and vegetables, there was some significant growth for some time, but it's sort of flattened out to where it's more of a expected in line with GDP or slightly higher type of growth. So where you were seeing really big growth in organic, you're seeing now more moderated growth in organic. So they're not where you don't have a growth in organic farming, you don't need a growth in organic fertilizer. So that's one place where there isn't much, and food inflation has, of course, contributed to that. As you've seen prices go up for everything, prices for organics have gone up as well, which has softened demand a little bit for organics. Um, the so targeting organic fertilizer alone is not likely to have a big value impact on meat and bone meal because it's not the primary place. It's even within Darling, it's not the primary outlet for our meat and bone meal, so it's not likely to have much of a of an impact on volumes or demand in the short term. It does serve as a pretty good value backstop, or there is a value backstop on meat and bone meal, and we sort of see that as composted poultry manure being that, because there's a market for composted poultry manure, and meat and bone meal provides a better alternative as a fertilizer than composted poultry manure. And so despite having some advantages as a fertilizer, it's still less than the value of feed for meat and bone meal. So how can we look at fertilizer a little bit differently and think about how we can address that? So the opportunity is to look at the circular bioeconomy, which is a theme of a lot of what we're talking about today, and looking at what happened with renewable diesel and fuels and fat prices. So we saw a big impact from the renewable diesel market growth and the interest from governments in decarbonizing. And so that was really driven by three things. You had economic development in interest, where we wanted to be able to grow the markets for these things. You had reducing imported energy. When the renewable diesel market was getting going, we were still importing lots of energy. Now we produce quite a bit of energy in the US, but it's still importing a lot of fuels. And so there's a focus on how can we domestically produce and sell different feedstocks and fats into the fuels market. And sustainability, of course. I mentioned at the top our statistic about removing more than 2 million cars equivalent emissions off the road every year with our renewable diesels. And that's really where the sustainability piece has really been able to add value to that market over time. So when you start to think about fertilizer in that same way, you think about who is the largest exporter of conventional fertilizer, and that's Russia. And the largest consumer of conventional fertilizer is China. And so you have some interesting, when you're thinking about kind of global markets and how they might continue to be shaped in the future years, you may have some opportunity for some different trade flows when it comes to how fertilizer is traded around the world, especially conventional fertilizer and some of the sources that are available for that. So let's think about that renewable diesel paradigm and think about applying it to fertilizer. And so, renewable diesel, you had economic development and that support for feedstock production. You can have a similar argument around incentivizing the circular economy. I think most of us in this room understand the benefits of rendered products, and from a circular economy perspective, from avoiding waste and really providing that value back. But the market doesn't always recognize that in the protein value, especially. The fats markets have started to recognize that in the terms of how they translate into fuels from a low carbon intensity. The market doesn't really recognize that from the benefits of the protein markets. And also supports production when you have, if you're reliant on areas where you're importing a lot from markets that may not be as friendly, there could be an opportunity to increase some domestic production. In renewable diesel, we saw reducing dependency on imported energy. You can look at exactly the same for imported fertilizer. And then sustainability. Again, conventional fertilizer application emits carbon. And as farmers are looking at how they can reduce their carbon footprint, even to sell corn or soy into feed markets, they're looking to bring down the carbon footprint of their fields. Organic fertilizers have a lower carbon footprint over their life cycle than conventional fertilizers do. So that's an opportunity there. Extending the life of a finite resource, I have an example of that here in just a second as well. And then that overall theme of enabling the circular economy is incredibly important as well. So when we talk about the finite resource piece of it, and so we look at the phosphate market. Phosphate's mined primarily for for fertilizer, and so there's a finite supply. I think the statistics are somewhere between tens to hundreds of years, depending on what papers or articles you read about it, there's, like any mined resource, there's lots of uncertainty around how much there might actually be. But in terms of what's accessible and what's known, we know it's finite and we know that it's not going to be around forever. So we need to look for alternatives in that. And again, looking at it from a regional perspective, lots of the imported phosphate comes from other places. It's not mined in the US or North America. It's mined in the Middle East and North Africa a lot. And meat and bone meal is a really great source of available phosphate. So you're keeping those nutrients in the cycle, in that circular economy. And that's really where that interest comes in terms of how we can help address these nutrient challenges, help provide that value back, and look at meat and bone meal as an alternative there. So one more sort of dive into why this is so important for the soil. And I mentioned thinking about feeding the soil like we would think about feeding an animal. And that's really where how we look at the fertilizers. When you grow, you're thinking about, rather than just feeding the plant and giving it that direct input that a conventional fertilizer does, we're really thinking about feeding the soil. And when you grow the soil microbiome, it increases the availability of those nutrients throughout the soil. And so there's there's a great example on the right of sort of how that happens from a soil science textbook that's been around for a really long time. So it's well known how increasing soil microbe activity can increase available nutrients. And so that's something that we really highlight in our fertilizer applications in terms of how we help the soil. And when you help the soil, you help the plant. And when you help the plant, you're helping the farmer, and that's all good for everybody. And then again, I think in my world, I talk a lot about carbon footprints of animal proteins, of other proteins, and people are looking at that. I know we're going to talk about carbon footprint of insects here in just a second. And that's a lot of people are really focused on that. And when you look at conventional fertilizer versus an organic fertilizer, a slow release fertilizer like meat and bone meal, your carbon impact is going to be quite a bit lower. So what do we need to do? Well, one, more research is always good. And we've seen some great presentations already this morning in terms of research that goes on. And can we look at fertilizer in much the same way as we've looked at fish applications and other things in terms of how the nutrients are really becoming available? Can we increase education on that and really get folks involved in that? Looking at, can we get more involved with legislation, with policy, to see, are there opportunities for growing in the way that organic fertilizer is looked at, much in the same way that renewable diesel was looked at? And that's really been driven by policy, a lot of the growth in that. And the ability to differentiate between different carbon intensities of fuels has really enabled that lift in fat prices. So is there something similar that can occur on the protein side of things with fertilizer? And so really looking to that playbook of renewable diesel, looking for industry group support, legislative engagement, and then really just continuing to talk about the circular economy and the benefits that, we were talking about how we're thinking about things of collecting animal byproducts, processing them, and creating value. That's really what we want to message, is what that value is, and not just from a dollar amount, but looking at the whole picture and seeing how we avoid emissions, how we avoid conventional fertilizer production, which avoids natural gas being pulled out of the ground. Most people don't know that conventional fertilizer is mostly made out of natural gas. And so, that's really where you can look at how do you address those issues that are broader through some of these markets and help people be aware of the benefits of that as well. So some potential catalysts for that, we have some, there's the fertilizer trade flows are complicated, but there's some challenges there. And so there may be some opportunity to address specific markets. The population is continuing to grow. And so there's going to be need for more food production and more fertilizer production as well to help keep that food production going as well. And so we know that we need to feed our soils and keep our soils healthy. That's the most important part of crop production, and that's really what we're focused on, is feeding that soil, making sure it's healthy, making sure it can support plant life. And then sustainability and the circular economy. I know I've said it 3 or 4 times already now, and that's really what this comes back to, is folks are looking for sustainable, long-term solutions that they can use to protect their land, to protect the food supply. And we think that, looking at these animal proteins in a fertilizer perspective can definitely add some value. So thanks very much. Happy to answer questions if we have some. I also have Rick's contact information up there. If you have questions about Darling or sustainability, that's definitely, I'm the right person. If you have questions about fertilizer, absolutely Rick is the correct person, but I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have.
So, and I'll add to that, Rick decided this was a good week for him to take